The fluorescent lights hum over linoleum floors that smell of antiseptic and floor wax, a sound like electricity dying slowly in a fluorescent tomb. Katie Rodriguez pushes a medication cart down the corridor of Sacred Heart Hospital in Portland, her movements economical, purposeful, the kind of efficiency that comes from having done harder things in worse places. She has worked here 6 months. 6 months of early shifts, difficult patients, the graveyard rotation nobody else wanted. 6 months of being invisible, which is exactly how she planned it. Her scrubs are navy blue, standard issue, pressed and clean. Her name badge shows only her first name and RN credentials. No photograph. She requested that during orientation and nobody questioned it. The badge clip is worn from constant use, the laminate slightly scratched. Under her locker on the 3rd floor, hidden behind a stack of folded scrubs, are a pair of worn combat boots. Desert tan leather, creased and salt-stained, the laces knotted at the base where shrapnel had burned through. The only physical evidence of a life the government had erased. Katie touches them sometimes during her breaks, running one finger along the scuffed heel, then closes the locker door fast, as if speed could erase the moment. As if no one had seen. She didn't know anyone was watching. Not yet. Dr. Marcus Hargrove stood in the doorway of the break room at 6:51 a.m., holding a patient chart and observing Katie with the calculated interest of a man cataloguing weaknesses. He was 53, silver-haired, wearing an Italian wool blazer over his hospital-issued coat. His stethoscope hung around his neck like a decoration, something ornamental that proved his status. He had been chief of medicine at Sacred Heart for 8 years. Before that, he'd been chief of surgery at Seattle General. He kept a photograph of himself on his office wall shaking hands with the hospital administrator and another of him at a charity gala with the mayor. He believed hierarchy was not merely practical but righteous. People had their place. His was at the top. Katie closed her locker. The sound was soft, a click of metal on metal. Hargrove noted the way she moved, economical, unrushed, neither eager to please nor deliberately defiant. She was competent, certainly. The nursing staff had made that clear when he'd asked about her during morning reports. Reliable. Never called in sick. Took the worst assignments without complaint. She'd been a travel nurse before Portland, picking up contracts in different cities, never staying more than 6 months to a year. Her references were sparse. Her prior employment history was thin. Red flags that he'd flagged during her hiring review, but he'd been overruled by human resources, who'd said her credentials checked out fine. Fine. He hated that word. Fine meant mediocre. Fine meant ordinary. But Katie Rodriguez was not ordinary. She was something else entirely, and it made him uneasy. The uneasiness transformed into something sharper during morning rounds at 7:30. The teaching rounds. Hargrove preferred an audience, medical students, residents, the nursing staff. He liked the way the room arranged itself around his authority, the way people deferred, the way they waited for his pronouncements. This morning he moved through the cardiac wing with his entourage, for residents trailing slightly behind, 2 nursing students, and Katie, who stood at the foot of each bed recording vitals and updating charts. Bed 4214 held a young man, early 20s, muscled in a lean way of athletes, with a training accident bandage on his left shoulder. Post-op from a torn rotator cuff repair. Routine case. The surgical resident gave the history, 22-year-old Special Forces operator, accident during a ruck march in the mountains, 5,000-foot elevation, caught his foot on equipment, fell hard, hyperextended the shoulder. Repair went well. Recovery should be straightforward. Katie approached the bedside and checked the post-op dressing with the kind of care that suggested she was checking something far more important than bandage placement. Her hands were steady, scarred across the knuckles, the kind of hands that had done things. Hargrove watched her pause for half a second when the young man opened his eyes, watched her take in his face with the particular intensity of someone recognizing a ghost. Then she smiled, a small, professional smile that didn't reach her eyes, and asked about pain levels. The young man's name was Marcus. Not the same Marcus as Hargrove. This one had the kind of eyes that had seen mountains and understood what happened on them. When Katie asked if he needed anything, he said no. When she said she'd be monitoring his vitals closely, he nodded as if she'd told him something important that nobody else had said. Hargrove made a mental note. The nurse recognizes the patient from something. Previous assignment. Previous city. Unprofessional fraternization possibility. But when he asked Katie later, casually, during the transition between patient 3 and patient 5, she said only that she'd cared for many military personnel and they all had similar post-op needs. The answer was smooth. Too smooth. A prepared answer. The break room was empty at 10:15 a.m. Katie sat alone with her coffee, lukewarm, the kind of coffee that had been sitting for 40 minutes while she worked. The break room smelled like old microwaves and someone else's lunch, fish, probably from yesterday's abandoned container in the refrigerator. The walls were beige, institutional, covered with employee notices about parking and harassment prevention. A single window overlooked the Portland skyline, grey buildings against a greyer sky, rain threatening but not yet falling. Katie's locker was number 247. She opened it slowly. Inside was a change of clothes, a protein bar, her phone on silent, and pushed to the very back, hidden behind the hanging scrubs, the combat boots. Tan desert leather. Worn in specific places, the heel where boots were thin from running, the side where a rifle strap had rubbed for years, the laces knotted thick because the original laces had burned away. She didn't touch them. She just looked. Her jaw clenched the way it did when she was accessing something behind locked doors in her own mind. The locker door opened behind her. Hargrove stood there, holding the patient chart for young Marcus, the one from bed 4214. He was smiling. "Interesting record," he said. His voice was soft, conversational. "Dangerous. Your previous assignments. Lots of military contractors. Lot of travel. They need good care," Katie said. She closed her locker without turning around. "Yes. And you seem to have expertise." He said the word like it tasted suspicious. "Where did you acquire that?" "Experience," Katie said. She turned to face him. Her eyes were grey, the color of Kandahar stone, and they did not waver. 13 years in hospitals. Trauma units. Burn centers. You pick things up. 13 years. That's a long career for someone so young. He tilted his head, studying her. "You don't look 35. "Thank you, doctor. I didn't mean it as a compliment." He stepped into the break room fully, and the space seemed to compress. Hargrove had the physical presence of someone who believed his body was more important than other people's comfort. He stood too close. He took up too much air. "I'm trying to understand who we've hired. A woman with gaps in her employment history. Military experience implied but never stated. References that are difficult to verify." Katie set her empty coffee cup on the counter. Her hands were steady. "I'm a good nurse. My evaluations speak for themselves. Your evaluations speak to your competence, not your truthfulness." He moved closer. "I've been here 8 years, Katie. I've hired dozens of nurses. The ones who hide things, the ones who don't fit the standard profile, they usually have reasons." "Everyone has reasons," Katie said. "Yes. And I find that when people don't talk about them, it's because the reasons would not reflect well." He was close enough now that she could see the small scar on his chin, a surgical scar, something he'd had done and never mentioned. "I don't like mysteries in my hospital. Mysteries make people nervous." Katie did not step back. People expected her to step back. People expected her to show discomfort. Instead she stood still, and in standing still she demonstrated something that Hargrove found deeply irritating: absolute absence of concern for his opinion. "Is there something specific you need, doctor?" "For now?" "No. But I'm going to be watching your work very closely." He smiled, the way wolves smile before they bite. I like to know exactly what people are capable of. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that he was right to watch. Because at 2:33 p.m., during a routine post-op check on young Marcus in bed 4214, something went very wrong. The monitors began to alarm, not the soft, informational alarm of a routine alert, but the aggressive, insistent scream of critical decline. Blood pressure dropping. Oxygen saturation plummeting. Heart rate climbing toward 160 and beyond. The kind of cascade that happens fast, that doesn't give doctors time to think, only time to act. Katie was there. She was always there for her patients. She moved toward the bed and assessed in the space of 2 seconds, the way Marcus was breathing in shallow gasps, the way his chest rose unevenly, the way his neck veins were distending like something was filling him from the inside. Tension pneumothorax. Air trapped in the pleural space, collapsed lung, pressure building, the heart being compressed. Code blue territory. Death territory. She reached for the equipment without calling for anyone, without waiting. Her hands moved with the precision of someone whose muscle memory was deeper than her conscious mind. 14-gauge angiocath needle. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The anatomy flashed in her mind: bone, muscle, membrane. She knew where every layer was. She'd done this in worse places, under worse circumstances, when the alternative was watching someone die. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping. It was a small sound but enormous in the silent room. Pressure relieving. Oxygen saturation climbing. 82. 85. 90. The young man's breathing eased. The chest rose evenly. Hargrove watched from the doorway. His expression did not change, but something in his body did. Some small shift in weight that suggested he had just learned something he did not want to know about the quiet nurse he'd been interrogating in the break room. Katie had not called for a doctor. She had not asked permission. She had simply acted, and in acting, she had saved a man's life with the kind of efficiency that belongs to people who have done this under fire. Under actual fire. The silence in the room was the kind that comes after violence stops. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. A nursing student stood frozen in the doorway with a crash cart. A resident had his hand on his phone ready to call the attending. But it was too late for the attending. It was already done. The damage, already prevented. Katie stepped back from the bed and pulled off the gloves. The sound they made was like a whip snapping. "He'll need a chest X-ray to confirm lung re-expansion," she said quietly. "And 4 fluids. His pressure's still lower than I'd like." She met Hargrove's eyes for exactly 1 second. "I'll monitor closely." She walked past him to update the chart, her movements unhurried, as if she hadn't just performed a procedure that only physicians were supposed to perform. As if she hadn't just revealed something that nobody was supposed to know. Hargrove stood in the doorway for 3 more seconds. Then he turned and walked away, and his expression was the expression of a man who had just identified a threat that nobody else could see. Hargrove didn't leave it alone. 3 days later, he was waiting at the nurse's station when Katie arrived for the day's shift, his posture casual but his eyes fixed like a predator measuring prey. The fluorescent lights hummed their monotonous white noise above them as he stood between the computer terminals and the medication dispensary, blocking the most direct path to the floor. 50 staff members were within earshot during shift change, phlebotomists sorting tubes, respiratory therapists checking equipment, nurses transitioning from nights to days. The timing was deliberate. "Rodriguez," he called out, loud enough to cut through the morning noise. "Come here a second." She approached, her movements measured, her expression neutral as still water. Her scrubs were faded blue, the fabric worn soft from 100 washes. The name tag pinned to her chest read simply, K. Rodriguez, RN. Hargrove smiled. It was the smile of a man accustomed to his voice being the loudest in any room. "I wanted to make you a bet," he said, and his tone was casual enough to seem like banter, that specific performance of friendliness that contained a knife underneath. "I'll give Rodriguez here 1 week before she quits." "Any takers?" Anyone want to put money on whether she makes it to Friday? He looked around at the gathered staff, his eyes bright with anticipation. Some of the younger nurses laughed nervously. Others looked away, suddenly very interested in their charts. One of the attending physicians, Sterling, smirked and shook his head like he was watching something inevitable unfold. Katie didn't blink. She met Hargrove's eyes for exactly 3 seconds, then said, "I'll get the morning census," and walked past him toward the patient rooms. Her voice had been quiet. Not submissive, just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes from someone who has already decided you're not worth engaging with. Hargrove's smile tightened at the edges. 2 days passed with unusual calm. Katie worked her assignments without incident, a 23-year-old post-op appendectomy, a 68-year-old with pneumonia on antibiotics, the young Special Forces operator who was recovering steadily, his breathing pattern easy and his color good. She checked vitals, changed dressings, documented everything with the meticulous precision of someone who understood that every word written in a chart was permanent. The worn combat boot stayed hidden in her locker, pushed into the very back behind her street shoes and a thermos she never used. But Hargrove had decided. That moment at the nurse's station when she'd refused to engage with his bet, when she'd walked past him as though he were furniture, that had shifted something in him. He wasn't the type of man who tolerated being invisible in a room. The cafeteria on Thursday at 12:41 p.m. became his stage. Katie carried her lunch tray through the crowded hospital cafeteria, soup in a ceramic bowl, a sandwich wrapped in paper, a bottle of water with the Sacred Heart logo printed on the side. The dining room was full. The department heads sat at their usual table near the windows. Floor nurses clustered in smaller groups. Administrative staff occupied the corner near the vending machines. 50 souls, give or take, all of them aware when Dr. Hargrove stood up from his chair at the physician's table. His elbow rose as she passed, angled outward at precisely the angle required to appear accidental. The tray tilted. The bowl tipped. Soup cascaded across the tile floor in a spreading arc of sodium and steam, broth splashing against her scrubs, silverware clattering like a bell announcing the show had begun. The sandwich tumbled. The water bottle rolled. The room went absolutely quiet. That particular silence that descends when cruelty has been performed in public and everyone is waiting to see how the person being hurt will react. Hargrove placed his hand over his mouth in an expression of exaggerated regret. "Oh, I'm so sorry, sweetheart," he said, and his voice was dripping with condescension thick enough to taste. "I didn't see you there. How clumsy of me." Katie knelt to clean it up. Her movements were methodical, calm, the way a soldier kneels to clear an area after an explosion, practical, efficient, completely detached. She reached for the tray, her right hand steady as a surgical laser. Not a tremor. Not a hesitation. Hargrove dropped a patient chart at her feet. The paper landed with a soft thwack against the wet tile. "While you're down there, sweetheart," he said, his tone now edged with something darker than humor, "seems like the right height for you. Pick that up. Would you?" The cafeteria held its breath. Katie took one measured breath. Her hand paused for a fraction of a second on the lip of the tray. Then a single tear escaped her left eye, not from shame, not from fear, but from something that looked like rage being swallowed whole. She wiped it away with her left hand, still maintaining eye contact with Hargrove, and rose slowly to her feet, the chart gripped in her right hand. When she spoke, her voice had changed. It was no longer the deferential tone of a new hire on her best behavior. It was lower, colder, a voice like steel wrapped in silk, the kind of voice that comes from someone who has given orders in languages most people have never heard, who has made decisions that meant life or death, who has stood over the dying and chosen to stand anyway. "I've picked up better men than you'll ever be," she said, "from worse places than this floor." The cafeteria froze. Hargrove's face flushed crimson. His jaw clenched. But then, because he understood that losing composure in front of 50 witnesses would undermine his authority, he forced a laugh, sharp and brittle and completely unconvincing. "Cute," he said, his voice tight. "Very cute, Rodriguez." Write up that chart by end of shift or don't bother coming back tomorrow. Katie didn't respond. She simply turned and walked toward the trash bin, disposed of the scattered remains of her lunch, rinsed the bowl at the sink, and left the cafeteria. Behind her, conversations resumed in a subdued hum. The moment had passed. But something had shifted. Hargrove had revealed himself completely, not as an authority figure, but as a predator testing the boundaries of his prey. Over the next 7 days, his escalation became systematic. Monday, she was assigned every weekend for the next 3 months, her shift preferences revoked. Her name was rescheduled from the comfortable day rotations into nights and split shifts. Tuesday, at rounds, he mispronounced her name repeatedly, Rodriguez instead of Rodriguez, and when she corrected him once, he smiled coldly and said, "Oh, I prefer my version better." The other physicians exchanged glances but said nothing. Wednesday, he reviewed her documentation and found no errors, so instead he questioned her bedside manner to a patient's family, implying that she had explained a procedure inadequately. The family had seemed perfectly satisfied until Hargrove planted the seed of doubt. By Friday, when he scheduled her performance review, he invited 2 board members to observe the meeting. Katie sat across from him in his office at 3 in the afternoon. The walls were decorated with his medical degrees, photographs of him at conferences, his sailboat moored at the marina outside Portland. He opened her file and asked her to explain basic nursing protocols, things she executed perfectly every single day. When she began to answer, he cut her off mid-sentence. "That's not what I asked, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping false patience. "Try listening this time." Katie's hands rested completely flat on the table in front of her, palms down, completely still. Every muscle in her body was under perfect control. She didn't flinch. She didn't speak out of turn. She simply waited, her eyes reflecting nothing, a woman who had learned long ago that the most effective response to psychological pressure was silence. The board members were beginning to look uncomfortable. That night, during her overnight shift, Katie was monitoring her for patients when she noticed something the electronic monitors hadn't flagged yet. The young Special Forces operator, the one she'd pulled from a burning vehicle 2 decades ago in Kandahar, the one whose name she'd never been supposed to remember but whose small body she could still feel in her hands as she'd breathed air back into his lungs, had begun to change. His respiratory rate was climbing, 16 breaths per minute at 9 p.m., 19 at 10, 22 by midnight. His oxygen saturation was dropping in increments so small the monitor hadn't triggered an alarm. 98%, 96, 94. His chest rise was asymmetrical, the left side moving less than the right. And his head was tilted very slightly to the right, a subtle postural shift that suggested pressure building on the left side of his thorax, air accumulating in the space between his lungs and his chest wall, compressing, suffocating. Tension pneumothorax. Building silently. Lethally. Katie checked the chart. Post-operative day 3, recovery progressing normally, no complications noted. She paged the on-call physician. No response. Paged again at 0203 hours. Nothing. His oxygen saturation was now 91% and still falling. His lips were losing their color. His breathing was becoming shallow, rapid, desperate, the pattern of a body fighting for air. She had 3 minutes, maybe 4, before his heart rate would spike, his blood pressure would crash, and cardiac arrest would announce itself through the monitor with the rhythmic beeping that meant death was close enough to touch. The procedure he needed, needle decompression at the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, a 14-gauge needle to release the pressure, to let the trapped air escape in a hiss that meant salvation, was technically outside her current scope. It required a physician's order, physician's presence, physician's authorization. That's what the paperwork said. That's what the law said. That's what the system said. But Katie's hands knew how to do it. Her hands had done it in sandstorms, in the dark, in the back of vehicles rolling across desert highways at 40 miles per hour, when there were no physicians available and the person bleeding out in front of her was still alive because her muscle memory had taken over. She pulled the crash cart. Her movements were economical, precise. She prepped the needle with the kind of focus that erased everything else in the world. The patient's eyes fluttered open, confused, frightened. "I'm right here," Katie said, and her voice was steady as concrete. "You're going to be okay." His saturation dropped to 88%. She positioned herself over the second intercostal space, the needle angled correctly, her hand steady, and that's when the automatic doors to the unit burst open and Dr. Hargrove arrived, because someone had called him, because protocol existed, because the universe sometimes decided to present impossible choices at the exact moment they became necessary. He saw her standing over the patient with a needle in her hand, saw the chart, saw the monitor displaying a saturation that should have triggered an immediate code, and his expression shifted from professional concern to something else entirely. Recognition. Threat assessment. Understanding. The operator's breathing pattern changed at 0200 hours. Katie noticed it first, the subtle shift in his chest rise, the lag between inhale and exhale, the way his body compensated for something going wrong beneath the surface. She'd seen this before. In Kandahar. In the back of a Humvee with incoming fire and a bleeding Marine who needed intervention in the next 60 seconds or he wouldn't make it to the FOB. She moved to his bedside and placed her palm against his ribs. The skin felt cool. Clammy. His oxygen saturation on the monitor read 94, but it was falling. 93, 92. The numbers descended like a countdown. Tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung. Air trapped in the pleural space, compressing his heart and lungs with every breath, suffocating him from the inside. The clinical signs assembled themselves in her mind: tracheal deviation, muffled breath sounds on the left side, hypertension creeping down. She could feel his heart rate accelerating beneath her fingertips. 118, 126. The body in shock, fighting a catastrophe the monitors hadn't quite caught yet because the machines lagged behind human intuition. But Katie's intuition had been forged in places the hospital didn't ask about. She turned and moved toward the supply cabinet with the kind of urgent focus that reads like meditation to the untrained eye. Controlled. Methodical. A 14-gauge angiocath needle. Chlorhexidine swab. Her hands knew the choreography. They'd performed this dance before in conditions far worse than a sterile hospital room with overhead lights and clean instruments. The needle was cool against her fingers, smooth stainless steel like the memory of competence she wasn't supposed to have. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Hargrove's voice cut across the room like a knife through silk. He'd been doing rounds on the floor. Of course he had. Of course he'd chosen this moment to circle back, to position himself where he could watch, where he could catch her in something he could use. Katie didn't answer. Didn't look up. Didn't break the thread of focus that connected her hands to the task. Hargrove moved toward her, his presence suddenly heavy, his breathing audible in the way breathing becomes audible when a man realizes he's witnessing something he doesn't understand. "I said stop." His voice pitched upward. A command that wasn't a request. A man accustomed to obedience, to the hospital hierarchy bending around his will. "You need authorization for any procedure. You need a physician's order. Step away from that patient right now." Katie's jaw tightened. Not from fear. From the effort of not responding. The second intercostal space, midclavicular line. She located it with her fingers, the ridge of bone, the space between ribs that felt like a map she'd memorized on a different continent. The skin felt warm under the chlorhexidine. Clean. Ready. Hargrove moved closer. She could smell the coffee on his breath, the starch in his shirt. The odor of institutional authority about to fracture. "Rodriguez, I'm calling security. You're violating protocol. You're practicing beyond your scope." His phone was already in his hand. Already half raised toward his ear. His fingers trembling with the adrenaline of a man watching his control slip. He didn't understand what he was looking at. The precision. The certainty. The hands of someone who'd held bleeding bodies together while mortars fell and medics screamed orders into radios that crackled with static and distant command. The needle went in at a 45-degree angle, slipping through muscle and fascia and membrane with the smooth inevitability of a key entering a lock. No hesitation. No second guessing. No protocol committee to consult. Just the ancient code of field medicine: see the problem, solve the problem, keep the patient breathing. The hiss of air escaping was immediate. Sharp. Audible. The sound of pressure releasing, of emergency concluding, of a life returning to the possibility of continuing. The operator's body convulsed once, the response of a nervous system flooded with sudden relief, and then his breathing deepened. His color shifted from ashen to pink. The monitors caught up to reality. Oxygen saturation climbed: 88. 91, 94. 97, the body's gratitude expressed in numbers, in the steady beep of a monitor that no longer screamed. Hargrove stood frozen. The phone in his hand still half raised. Katie pulled a transparent dressing from the supply drawer and secured the catheter with movements that looked like ritual, like she'd performed this procedure 1,000 times in hallways and tents and backseats of helicopters while men screamed and the sky lit up with ordnance. The operator's breathing normalized. His color continued climbing. His heart rate descended from combat rhythm to something approaching rest. 90 seconds. That was how long it took to pull a man back from suffocation using equipment designed in 1967 and skill designed over 20 years of service the hospital didn't know she'd rendered. She turned to look at Hargrove directly for the first time since she'd begun. Her eyes were flat. Unreadable. The kind of composure that comes from having already stared into worse. "He's stable," she said. Her voice was quiet. No apology. No explanation. No request for his understanding or approval. Just information, delivered like a field report to someone who didn't need to understand it to act on it. Tension pneumothorax resolved. Catheter secured. Monitor vitals every 15 minutes for the next 4 hours. Hargrove's face had gone pale. The phone in his hand was no longer trembling because his entire arm had gone rigid. He watched her walk past him, steady, unhurried, the boots she was wearing making that soft percussion sound against the tile floor, and he understood in that moment that he'd been trying to dismantle a woman whose foundation was constructed from material he didn't have a category for. She documented everything with clinical precision in the patient's chart. Time: 0203 hours. Indication: acute tension pneumothorax. Procedure: needle decompression, 14-gauge angiocath, second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Outcome: immediate resolution of pneumothorax, patient stabilized, oxygen saturation 98%, sinus rhythm maintained. The documentation was so meticulously accurate, so medically fluent, so utterly indisputable that it read like an indictment of the lie she'd been living. Hargrove was already making calls before she'd finished the notation. His office door closed, but his voice carried through the walls of the hospital like something weaponized. Yes, an authorized procedure. Practicing well beyond scope. I need you to look into her credentials immediately. The phone made sounds, confirmations, agreements, the machinery of institutional power beginning to mobilize. Katie could hear him pacing. Breathing hard. His words coming faster now, building momentum. I'm requesting an immediate investigation. Patient safety issue. Possible falsified documentation. Yes, tonight if possible. She walked to the break room and poured herself a cup of coffee that tasted like copper and patience. The break room was empty at 0210 hours. Just fluorescent lights humming their electric hymn and the smell of reheated meals from someone's lunch break. She sat at the table with her hands wrapped around the mug and felt the heat transfer into her palms like information. The operator would live because she'd acted. That was the only fact that mattered. The investigation, the termination, the machinery of institutional consequence, those were other facts. Smaller facts. Facts that bent around the central truth: she'd kept him breathing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was knowing that Hargrove was already weaponizing what she'd just done, transforming her competence into evidence of her deception, turning her skill into the instrument of her own erasure. She could hear his second call now, clearer because she'd moved closer, because the hospital's walls were thin and voices carried. I need to file a complaint with the state licensing board. She performed the procedure. No physician's order. No authorization. She has to have forged her credentials because no nurse with legitimate training would act without protocol. 3 more calls before midnight. To the board president. To an outside investigator Hargrove had apparently used before. To someone whose title Katie didn't catch but whose authority seemed to make Hargrove's voice change from furious to obsequious. The script never varied: unauthorized procedure, falsified credentials, immediate action required, patient safety concern, investigation opening now. The words like tools, like he was building something from her competence. A case. A termination. A reason to remove the quiet nurse who didn't flinch and didn't break and didn't play the game by rules she'd been asked to pretend she'd agreed to follow. Katie sat in the break room and thought about the combat boots in her locker. The left one had a scuff on the toe from a cement block she'd kicked in anger after a burial ceremony. The right one held the weight of 17,000 steps through Kandahar dust while she kept men alive under conditions that would have broken most people. The team leader, Gunnery Sergeant Mark Holloway, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, had died making sure she got out. Had held a perimeter for 4 hours while she covered a wounded Marine's entry wound with her hand and kept him breathing long enough for the medevac to arrive. Had sent her home with explicit orders: disappear. Become someone else. Let this part of your life go, because if the government finds out what happened that night, what actually happened, there won't be anywhere far enough away. She'd been following his orders ever since. 13 years of being invisible. 13 years of keeping her hand steady and her voice quiet and her past buried so deep that even she sometimes forgot it was there. And it had only taken 90 seconds to crack the entire facade. 90 seconds of acting like herself instead of acting like the person she was supposed to pretend to be. She returned to the patient's bedside and found the operator's eyes open. Conscious. Aware. Looking at her with the kind of recognition that exists outside of memory, the way the body knows something the mind hasn't processed yet. She checked his vitals without speaking. Blood pressure normal. Heart rate 83. Oxygen saturation 98%. He was going to be fine. He was going to live. He was going to walk out of this hospital and never know that the nurse who'd saved him in Kandahar had just saved him again, and that the second salvation was going to cost her everything she'd built in Portland. "Thank you," he whispered. Katie nodded. She didn't trust her voice not to carry information it shouldn't carry. She adjusted his fore and made a note about the stable vitals and moved toward the door because staying in his room longer would be noticed, and noticed was what she couldn't afford to be anymore. The call came through at 08 for 7 hours. Dr. Hargrove was already on his private line, already assembling the architecture of her destruction like a man who'd spent 20 years learning how to weaponize institutions. He'd seen her hands move with that impossible precision. He'd watched her navigate crisis the way most people navigate their own homes, with the muscle memory of someone who'd lived in worse places than Portland. And he understood, with the clarity of a predator recognizing another predator, that this quiet woman represented a threat he could not tolerate. His first call went to the hospital board president at 08 for 9. "We have a serious credentialing issue," Hargrove said, voice smooth as surgical steel. "One of our nurses performed an invasive procedure last night without authorization. Needle decompression on a pneumothorax. That's emergency medicine. That's beyond scope. That's a liability nightmare." He let the silence work. Silence was a weapon too. "I'm concerned about what else she's been doing. What else she's been hiding." The board president heard the words Hargrove meant instead of the ones he said. "I saw something I shouldn't have. I need it gone." By 09:12, Hargrove had contacted Katie's listed references. The first number, St. Mary's Medical Center in Tacoma, where she'd supposedly worked for 3 years, connected him to a department that had no record of anyone by that name. The second reference, a supervisor at Naval Hospital Bremerton, came back the same way. No Katie Rodriguez. No employee file. No forwarding information. It was as if the woman existed in fragments, in pieces that didn't connect to any larger structure. Hargrove smiled. This was better than he'd imagined. This was evidence of something deeper than insubordination. By 1100, outside investigators, the kind of firm that specialized in credential fraud, the kind that didn't ask questions about why a hospital board president wanted them moving fast, had been brought into the hospital through a side entrance. Hargrove had made the call himself, pulling favors from 3 board members who owed him money or worse. Routine audit, he'd told them. Standard vetting. Nothing unusual. Within 6 hours, those investigators would file a report that didn't need to be accurate to be destructive. Hargrove understood that in institutional warfare, the speed of accusation mattered more than the weight of evidence. Katie worked through her shift that afternoon without knowing her life was being dismantled in conference rooms and office calls. She moved through the hospital the way she always did, efficient, quiet, present without demanding presence. She checked on the Special Forces operator. His oxygen saturation was 97%. His chest was expanding symmetrically. His color was good. He was alive because of what she'd done, because her hands had remembered something her paperwork could never show. She didn't allow herself to look at him long. Looking would create a connection. Connection was risk. At 15:30, the administrative assistant who worked for the HR director found Katie in the supply closet, restocking trauma shears. "The board wants to see you," the assistant said. "Conference room. Now." "It's urgent." Katie didn't ask why. She'd been in enough situations to recognize the tone of machinery shifting into its final configuration. She removed her gloves. Washed her hands. Checked her reflection in the bathroom mirror, composure held, jaw unclenched, eyes still flat. She walked to the conference room the way soldiers walk toward fire, with acceptance of what was coming. The room was arranged for execution. The board president sat at the center of the table, flanked by the HR director on his left and Dr. Hargrove on his right, positioned by the window where the afternoon light cast his silhouette into something approaching authority. The 3 of them had the look of people who'd already made their decision 6 hours ago and spent the interval manufacturing the paperwork to match. "Please, sit," the board president said. Katie Saturday. The board president slid a folder across the desk. "We've completed our investigation into your employment records, your listed credentials, and your actions during last night's incident. We have significant concerns." Katie opened the folder. The documents inside were a collage of redactions and dead ends. References that led nowhere. Employment gaps that became abysses. A credential audit that highlighted the absence of verifiable educational records. It was all technically accurate. It was also all meaningless, a collection of empty spaces arranged to suggest fraud. "Your references cannot be verified," the HR director said. "Your nursing license shows graduation from a program we cannot locate. And last night's procedure, needle decompression, is well outside the scope of nursing practice. That's physician-level emergency medicine." Hargrove finally spoke, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a man holding a weapon he'd been waiting to use. "It suggests deliberate falsification of credentials. It suggests you've been misrepresenting your qualifications to this hospital since your hire date." He paused. "Effective immediately, you're terminated for practicing beyond your scope and maintaining falsified employment records. Security will escort you to collect your personal items. You'll then exit the building." It wasn't a conversation. It was a sentence being read aloud to someone who'd already been convicted in every room except this one. Katie stood. The board president pushed an envelope across the desk, her termination letter, already signed, already sealed. Katie picked it up. She didn't open it. She didn't speak. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was measured. She turned and walked toward the door where a security officer was already waiting, his posture suggesting he'd been briefed on what kind of disruption to expect and prepared accordingly. As she passed Hargrove's position by the window, she didn't acknowledge him. But Hargrove watched her move with an intensity that suggested he was expecting something, a crack, a moment of distress, some confirmation that he'd successfully broken something that had tried to hide itself in his hospital. Katie gave him nothing. She moved past like she was moving through a space that didn't contain him at all. The walk to her locker felt longer than 6 months of shifts had made it. The security officer followed 3 paces behind, present but not intrusive, the physical embodiment of institutional weight. Katie opened her locker. The combat boots were there, sitting on the shelf where she'd placed them 6 months ago. She stared at them. She reached for the cardboard box the security officer handed her, the kind of box hospitals give to recently terminated employees, exactly the right size to carry the pieces of a professional life that had never actually existed. She packed the cracked mug that said "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading white letters. She packed the dying succulent that had survived on windowsill water and neglect. She packed the only photograph from Kandahar, her team leader, 19 years younger, standing in front of a sand-colored building with his arm across her shoulders, both of them carrying the kind of exhaustion that comes from staying alive when the math suggested they shouldn't have. The boots stayed in the locker. She couldn't carry them. Some things had to be left behind. The rain started as she walked out through the staff entrance, the kind of Portland rain that wasn't dramatic but persistent, the kind that soaked through fabric through sheer stubbornness. The security officer watched her go but didn't follow past the parking lot threshold. She was already disconnected from the hospital's geography. Already becoming a problem for a different institution to manage. Katie stood at the bus stop on Martin Luther King Boulevard, the cardboard box getting darker as the rain found its way through the thin cardboard. She watched the water bead on the photograph inside the plastic frame, creating small distorted mirrors of the face that had stopped existing 17 years ago. She'd followed every rule. She'd stayed invisible. She'd performed the mathematics of invisibility perfectly, present but unobserved, useful but unremarkable, carrying expertise she could never display without erasing the person she'd constructed to survive. And the only purpose she had left, the only way she'd justified remaining alive when her team leader had not, was slipping away like water through cardboard. She didn't know it yet, but standing at that bus stop in the rain, Katie Rodriguez was at the exact moment when her silence was about to become louder than any weapon she'd ever carried. Her 17-year-old son found her on that bench outside their apartment, rain soaking through her jacket, and he had the lockbox she'd forbidden him to ever open. The one hidden behind the panel in her bedroom closet. The one that held everything the government had erased. He didn't ask permission. He just drove her back to Sacred Heart, and when they walked through those emergency room doors at 1847 hours, the entire hospital board had convened in the main conference room with something else entirely. 150 Special Forces officers standing in dress uniforms, their presence filling the corridor like a force of nature that made the fluorescent light seem dim by comparison. The Special Forces operator she'd saved, the boy from Kandahar, grown now into a warrior with steady hands and haunted eyes, stood at attention beside his team leader, a Navy SEAL with silver insignia who'd flown in from Virginia Beach. The boy's voice cracked when he said it, Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez, United States Navy. The room went dead silent. Nobody moved. The board members who'd signed her termination papers 4 days ago sat frozen in their chairs, suddenly understanding the magnitude of what they'd done. Her son placed the medals on the conference table one by one. The board president's hands trembled as he opened the declassified file that had arrived by emergency federal order that morning. Each page made his face lose more color. Bronze Star. The president's voice wavered reading the citation. Silver Star. He had to pause, swallow hard. 2 Purple Hearts. The SEAL team leader from Virginia Beach named each decoration aloud, and when he reached the Navy Cross, his voice broke entirely as he described the night Katie had held a perimeter alone for 4 hours after an ambush in Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, 4 hours while 16 wounded Marines reached safety because she would not move, would not surrender, would not let them take anyone else. The silence that followed wasn't the absence of sound. It was the sound of certainty collapsing. Dr. Hargrove attempted to forge records, the FBI agent announced from the doorway, and the entire room turned as federal agents entered the conference room with the precision of a military operation. The documents were spread on the table: fabricated complaints, backdated performance reviews, communications proving he'd directed the outside investigator to manufacture violations. Every move coordinated. Every step calculated. Every single piece a felony. The charges were read in a voice like a judge's gavel: falsifying medical records, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to defraud, filing false reports with a medical licensing board. Hargrove never made it to the parking lot. He was escorted from his office on the 7th floor, the one with the mahogany desk and the city view he'd spent 8 years acquiring, by agents with credentials and handcuffs. He passed the nurses' station where he'd made his bets about which staff members would break under pressure. He walked through the cafeteria where he'd knocked Katie's breakfast tray to the floor in front of 50 witnesses, and every single person working that shift turned to watch him pass. He moved through the administrative wing where the board members whose favors he'd called in, whose careers he'd elevated in exchange for loyalty, now sat in conference rooms giving depositions about the pressure he'd applied, the threats he'd made, the systematic destruction of anyone who wouldn't bow to his authority. The FBI read the charges in the hospital lobby, the one place where patients and families and visitors could see him being led out in handcuffs, his medical license suspended pending investigation, his hospital privileges revoked before the ink on his termination papers dried. His attorney's bills piled up within a week. $3,000 for emergency representation. $5,000 more to file motions. The medical board opened investigations into every termination he'd overseen in the past 5 years, 15 cases total. 13 of them appealed and 1 reinstatement with back pay. 3 other nurses came forward. 2 residents. A physician assistant. All of them forced out for the same reason: they'd threatened his authority. All of them blackballed through his network. All of them now with settlements and apologies from the hospital board. His wife served divorce papers within 9 days of his arrest, citing irreconcilable differences and the public humiliation that made her family's reputation untenable. She took the house. She took the investment accounts. She took everything except the name that no longer meant what it used to. The young Special Forces operator stepped forward in that conference room and looked at Katie without flinching. "You saved my life in Kandahar when I was 7 years old. I was bleeding out in the back of a truck, and you made my hand stop shaking by making your hands move fast. I've spent 20 years trying to be the man you thought I could be." Her son's hand tightened on her shoulder. The SEAL team leader extended his hand and Katie shook it, a firm grip that communicated respect in a language older than words. The board president offered full reinstatement with back pay going back to her termination date. The military offered consulting opportunities. The university hospital system offered a position as medical director of trauma services. Katie listened to every offer, every apology, every attempt to undo what they'd allowed to happen. She was silent for so long the room held its breath. Then she spoke, and her voice had changed so completely that for a moment nobody recognized it as hers. It carried the weight of command, the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I need one thing before I decide anything. I need to retrieve something from my locker." Nobody asked what. Nobody questioned her. They simply moved aside and let her walk to the basement level where the employee lockers lined the concrete walls, all the small metal doors that contained the private lives of people who'd chosen to spend their days healing others. She opened hers slowly, and pulled out the pair of worn combat boots that had survived Kandahar, that had survived military hospitals and combat zones and 17 years of careful invisibility. She held them for a moment, boots that still had red dust in the treads, boots that had walked through fire and carried her out alive. 2 years later, someone spotted Dr. Hargrove selling insurance from a folding table at a strip mall on the east side of Portland. Khakis and a borrowed polo shirt with someone else's company logo. He looked up when people walked by, but most didn't make eye contact. His once polished shoes had scuffs. His wedding ring was gone. He sold 2 policies that week to people who didn't know what he'd done, who didn't know the history written in the way he couldn't quite meet their eyes. At Sacred Heart Hospital, Katie Rodriguez kept those worn combat boots displayed in her office where she could see them every morning. She'd been reinstated as Director of Emergency Medicine, and she'd chosen not the executive floor with the mahogany desk but the basement office next to the ambulance bay, closer to where the work actually happened. The boots sat on the shelf behind her desk, next to her Navy Cross in a shadow box her son had insisted she display. The cracked mug he'd glued back together sat on her desk beside them. So did the photograph from Kandahar and the succulent that had finally died but that she kept anyway because it had survived longer than anyone expected it to. She ran the best emergency department in the Pacific Northwest. 3 published papers on combat casualty care in civilian settings. A monthly training course that Special Forces medics flew in to attend, and they came because Katie Rodriguez had something no textbook could teach: the ability to make young medics understand that the person in front of them might die not because they weren't smart enough or fast enough, but because sometimes you do everything right and the body still chooses to quit. She taught them how to live with that. She taught them that failure with honor beats success with shortcuts. She taught them the way someone had once taught her, with precision, discipline, and the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world can offer. The young operator whose life she'd saved that night at Sacred Heart worked at the VA now, teaching other veterans to process their trauma. He still visited every few months, and they never talked about Kandahar. They didn't need to. Some understanding runs deeper than words. When a new nurse made a mistake and froze, terrified of consequences, Katie put a hand on her shoulder and spoke in a voice like steady ground beneath shifting sand. "I've seen worse. You'll do better. That's how this works." Her staff learned quickly that she had no tolerance for politics or hierarchy or the kind of performative authority that Hargrove had traded his career for. She had tolerance for excellence and honesty and the kind of exhaustion that comes from trying to save everyone. Her son was in nursing school now, following the only example that had ever made sense to him, the example of quiet strength, of choosing to help when it would have been easier to hide. Sometimes parents brought their kids to meet her after she'd saved them, and Katie would kneel down to their eye level the way someone once knelt for a small boy in the back of a burning vehicle in Kandahar, making eye contact and speaking slowly and making sure they understood they were going to be okay. Those boots stayed visible. Visible every single day. A reminder that some things stay buried only as long as the truth allows. You've just watched what happens when invisible becomes undeniable. Katie's story is real in the way that matters most, in the way that speaks to something true about human beings. The quiet ones often carry the heaviest weight. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever known something about yourself that the world wasn't ready to see, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next story about people the system tried to erase but couldn't quite kill. Like this video if you believe that sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Comment below with your thoughts on what happened to Hargrove and whether you think his punishment fit the crime. Thank you for watching.